So we're going to look at a story this morning of a healing that Jesus shared with somebody, and probably that we'll all be able to relate to it in some way or another. But that line, "He took my sin and my sorrow," if I could change it, I would say, "He took my shame and my suffering, and he made them his very own." That's why I chose that psalm, because it speaks of shame. I'm going to read from John chapter 8, the first 11 verses. Then they all went home, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say?" And John, in his helpful way of writing these things, says to us, the reader, they were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away, one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." It's early in the morning, dawn. Jesus, it appears, has probably been up all night, maybe praying, and now he's at the temple early teaching, and already there's a crowd. And his teaching is interrupted as the scribes and the Pharisees arrive with a woman caught in the act. I mean, that's such kind of, I don't know how to describe it, but those words are, it's almost like they're in lights, isn't it? Caught in the act. There's the implication that in their minds she has already been judged and sentenced, and the sin they declare is punishable by stoning. So just picture the scene for a moment. Jesus, surrounded by the crowds. I wonder if they were all standing or were they all sitting? Was he perched on something? Just picture the scene in the temple courts. And there's a bit of a disturbance that starts at the back. And the people are listening to Jesus, but the disturbance begins to come a bit closer. Maybe the people part to allow this entourage through. The scribes and the Pharisees are bristling with indignation and righteousness and, all of that. Maybe the crowd are a bit embarrassed by what's going on, uncomfortable. Maybe there's a tension in the air. The woman, I wonder if she was wearing anything. Snatched in the act, as it were. Maybe she'd grabbed a sheet that she could hastily cover herself, or is she kind of standing there in that pose of humility, humiliation actually, just trying to cover herself? Don't get too close to her, she might be unclean. But close enough that you can hear what's going on. Because you want to hear what's going on, don't you? And she's denied even the dignity of a name. Or was that John's kindness? Because her life changed from this encounter on, and he didn't want a name and shame. I'm quite sure that everybody here may not have lived through what this woman has lived through, but we know what it is to be vulnerable, to be exposed in some way, and I don't necessarily mean nakedly exposed, but to be exposed in some way that doesn't shine your character or personality in the best light. Maybe somebody's lied about you and others believe it. The humiliation, the isolation of kind of being outcast and condemned and judged by those who probably don't even know you. Accusations that may or may not be just. And that deep pain of rejection. We all know what that feels like, don't we? Even if we haven't been in the position of the woman standing there in this moment. And it's uncomfortable to think about these kinds of emotions because they're always ones that we would prefer not to experience. We run away from shame type things, don't we? We want to escape from it. We don't have to be wearing her shoes to know something of her pain, I suspect. And we encounter them every day, from the major life events of trauma and abuse to the smaller everyday events that kind of say to us over and over, you're not good enough, you're not worth enough, you don't belong. And no matter how hard we try, we can't make ourselves good enough, can we? But we try. And of course, shame is one of the most powerful emotions that we experience as people. Because at the root of it, there's a lady in America called Brené Brown who writes a lot about shame. And she says that at the heart of shame is the fear that we're not good enough. It's the fear that we don't belong, the fear that we're flawed and unworthy of those relationships. And of course, shame keeps us from relationship with God if we're not careful. Because we're not good enough for him either. It even makes us fear that actually we're not worthy to be healed or saved or restored. So for this woman who was probably feeling shame at its most raw in this moment, trapped as she was by these people. Interesting the man's not there, isn't it? It's just the woman. Just the woman. The scribes and the Pharisees say to Jesus, caught in the act, can't get away from it, undeniable, guilty. And they quote the law, she should be stoned. What do you say, Jesus? And it is a trap. And I could go off down a tangent of explaining the trap, but it's not quite where I want to go this morning. Basically, whatever Jesus answered, they would have caught him in a kind of a pedantic way. But you can look that up for yourselves. I want to focus on the woman and on Jesus' response to her. As she stands there, I wonder if there is, how would you be standing if you were there? Would you be kind of, so stone me then? You know, would you have that kind of aggressive defiance about you? Or more likely, head hanging, not wanting to look anybody in the eye, least of all Jesus? I suspect that's how she was. All the eyes of the crowd on her. So what does Jesus do? What does he say? He actually says very little. He doesn't speak and argue the law. He doesn't tell them that if he allows the stoning, then the Romans will have him because Jews weren't allowed to kill. I think he probably does what is least expected, and that sounds like Jesus, doesn't it? To do what is least expected. He bends down and he begins to write in the sand. And at this point, all the commentators that you read, or most of them anyway, not that I've read every single one, but many of the commentators ask, I believe, the wrong question. They speculate on what he's writing. What might he be writing? And there's the possibilities that he might be writing out all their sins, and people read the list of sins and recognize their own. There's the possibility that he's quoting from the Old Testament. I think the question we should be asking is why, not what. Why was he writing in the sand? Well, I think the answer to that is, for the first time since her capture, she is no longer the centre of attention. All the eyes in the crowd, I suspect, are trying to work out what it is that Jesus is writing. In fact, I suspect Jesus could not have covered her more thoroughly if he'd given her his cloak than doing what he's doing. She is no longer the focus of attention. Is that the first healing moment of this woman? Is that the first act of kindness shown to her in a long time? An act of compassion, an act of love? Quietly, kindly, not a word spoken. Diverting attention away from rather than towards. He covered her with dignity, didn't he? I think that would be my phrase. Covered her with dignity. The scribes and the Pharisees don't let this go on too long. They keep on with their questions, their agenda, and Jesus continues to ignore them. I wonder how the woman feels now. Perhaps she's now become an interested spectator. Couldn't have predicted this. What's going to happen? She's still not got away with her life, but, it's not going quite the way she thought it might, perhaps. She was sure she would be stoned, and now she has no idea what's going to happen next. And then John says, when Jesus straightened up, John was clearly there. This is eyewitness detail, isn't it? Jesus straightened up, and he says, go ahead, stone her. Only if you have not sinned yourself. And then he goes back to writing in the sand again. Gives them space for the penny to drop, that the trap they carefully set for him had sprung on themselves, and they were now court. Of course they could not. I wonder if the only sound that you can hear now is the thud of stones being dropped. As the crowd realise what's happened and they just drop their stone, their little boulder, and drift away. Until it is just Jesus and the woman. So far, neither has spoken to the other. And now Jesus speaks. Does no one condemn you? And she's respectful in her answer. No, sir, no one. And Jesus said, neither do I. It's not the work of Jesus to condemn and judge. He says, I did not come to judge. I came to save, not to judge. So hard to believe that sometimes, isn't it? We are so good at condemning ourselves and believing that that's what then Jesus sees when he looks at us. Because we've condemned ourselves, we must have got it right. And Jesus says, no, I didn't come to condemn. I came to love. I came to show mercy. And he says to her, go and sin no more. And there's a curious, unspoken thing that I think we're left with. Go and sin no more. Go. Go on a journey. And effectively, he's saying, depart from the way of life you have been living and start again. Wow. Start again. New life. And we're left with some questions. Did Jesus forgive her? Was she forgiven? She didn't ask for it. He doesn't say those words. But he says, go and start again. We don't know if she repents, all the traditional things that we might want people to engage in before they're forgiven, before they receive the forgiveness of Jesus. None of that. He cuts through all of that, Jesus does. Go and live in the freedom. They did not condemn you. I don't condemn you. Go and live in that freedom. The treatment of Jesus, of this lady in this moment, is grace and mercy. Grace and mercy that she could change her life and live differently. He clothed her shame with dignity, took the attention upon himself and away from her, and he does no less for you and for me. We might use our shame as a barrier. No, Lord, I can't do work for you. I can't do this. I can't do that. I can't come close. I'm too shameful. I'm too full of this. I'm too full of that. I'm not worthy. And Jesus says, no, 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 no. She went away healed and restored in the most precious ways, and we can be too.